The death of number 22. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, this story is not about the coronavirus pandemic as far as we know. Number 22 is now the late Fred Curly Neal of the Harlem Globetrotters, who passed away at the age of 77 this week. And I thought we would take a break from our nonstop coverage, which folks can see at BillWhittle.com, of this coronavirus pandemic, and consider a man who had an impact in sport and beyond sport. First of all, let me ask you, because I haven't talked with you about this before. When I say Curly Neal, what do you think of?
Well, I think of a Harlem Globetrotter, and maybe a better question would be...
That's the one.
Maybe a better question would be, what do I think of the Harlem Globetrotters? It's hard to appreciate the Harlem Globetrotters in today's society. Needless to say, they've essentially, I'm sure they still exist in some form or another. But when I was growing up as a kid in the 70s and late 60s, the Harlem Globetrotters were everywhere. It was the Harlem Globetrotters on Scooby-Doo and the Harlem Globetrotters, blah, 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 blah. And
they were in the Gilligan's Island movie, believe it or not.
There you go. So for people who didn't actually grow up with them, I'm sure they look like something of a joke. For those of you who are very young, the Harlem Globetrotters is kind of a basketball demonstration team, at least ostensibly that's what they were. They would come in and do all kinds of incredibly great basketball tricks. Then they'd play a game against the Washington Generals. And I don't remember who the comedian was, or I really can't remember his name, but he said he just lost a fortune because he kept betting on the Generals because he felt that they were, overdue. But the thing that most people don't understand about the Globetrotters is not only how much they did for morale of Black Americans, seeing them on TV, seeing them excelling, and to a large degree making fun of the white basketball players with just incredibly intricate basketball tricks. They were extremely funny. They're extremely talented, and more than even what they did for the Black community, I think, the Harlem Globetrotters the Harlem Globetrotters were almost like a shoehorn into mainstream white culture for so much of Black culture. Bill Cosby was the first network Black star. He was the first person ever to star in a regular TV series on network TV. He was an I Spy with Robert Culp. And the Harlem Globetrotters were very much like Jackie Robinson, who preceded them quite a bit. These people were the forefronters. I put Nichelle Nichols in that category from Star Trek as well. These were the people that not only provided Black audiences with something to look up to, but provided white audiences with examples of talent and competence and skill that were anathema to the racism that was pretty endemic in the culture up until the probably mid to late 60s and into the 70s and so on. And that's the word, by the way, skill. And I think probably, of course, the predecessor of them all in terms of pop culture was Sidney Poitier. These few individuals managed to provide a great deal of optimism and hope for the Black community, and managed to get white audiences comfortable with the idea of Blacks in the mainstream media because they were just so good. They were just so talented. They were so approachable. They were so likable. They were so accessible. And Curly was one of those. The name I remember from the Globetrotters is Meadowlark Lemon, but that's probably just because the name was just so remarkable.
Meadowlark Lemon and Curly Neal were among just, I think, 4 or 5 Globetrotters who had their jersey numbers retired. Another one being Wilt Chamberlain, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But number 22, Fred Curly Neal's jersey was retired. He played some 6,000 exhibition games between 1963 and 1985. he really wanted to play professional basketball, but didn't get an opportunity to do that. And Bill, it's interesting because there are any number of professional basketball players in years to follow that who attribute some of their play style. And in fact, you could say the entire NBA has become a lot more freewheeling and entertaining because of the Globetrotters. But specifically, Detroit Pistons all-star Isaiah Thomas said, "Curly Neal taught me how to dribble."
Among other things, you could argue could make a compelling argument that all of the present day worship of basketball stars, Magic Johnson, all of them, LeBron James, Jordan, all of them were made possible by the Harlem Globetrotters. And Scott, I think this is sometimes it's the little things that are so important. Do you know what the single most important thing about the Harlem Globetrotters was, in my opinion?
Go for it.
Their uniforms.
Good point.
Yeah. No question about it.
It's all
None.
red, white, and blue. It's the stars
red,
and stripes.
white, and blue. They were wearing the stars and stripes. They were wearing the American flag. That's the most important thing about the Harlem Globetrotters. They wouldn't have been the Harlem Globetrotters without that. That was the genius of the Harlem Globetrotters. It was the genius of that entire time in the civil rights movement, where what they did was they literally put on the uniform of the U.S. flag and became kind of America's basketball team. By wearing the American flag and by always winning, although I still got a feeling these Washington Generals are due. I just got a vibe. That by wearing that flag, that identified this all-black basketball team with patriotism, and they were flag carriers. In a sense, they were like the Olympic basketball team for the United States that we weren't allowed to have until, well, I remember what the year was when they finally got the dream team together. Was it the '88 Olympics? Something, I don't know, somewhere around there, '84. But up until then, athletics had to be amateur based in the Olympics anyway. And here's a team of basketball players wearing the American flag, and it's iconic. It's impossible to imagine the Globetrotters without that uniform. And
most of us from the 1970s, Bill, by the way, you probably realize this because I know you're an aficionado of this kind of information, but ABC's Wide World of Sports really took a lead role in featuring the Globetrotters. And so my memories from the 1970s are probably from watching ABC Sports coverage on that Wide World of Sports.
Exactly. And it's again, I think the greatest tribute to the Globetrotters, this is a complex argument, but I think there's some merit to it. I think the anonymity of the Globetrotters in today's society, the fact that we don't talk about the Globetrotters, they're not media figures anymore, any of that stuff. I think that's a tribute to their success. I think it's an absolute monument to their success. We don't talk about an exhibition team of black basketball players, not because we talk about real black basketball players who are just dominating the sport and continue to get better every year, provide more and more role models for young Americans of black and white and everybody else. The Globetrotters were so effective at inserting the presence of black Americans into the culture that they became irrelevant. They succeeded to the degree that they no longer became needed. And this is another thing that's very difficult for people today to understand. Millennials are constantly talking about racism, but the actual victory over racism in this country was accomplished by the boomers. They hate hearing that, but it's true. The millennials grew up in a post-racial society. Boomers were born into a highly racist society, and it was the boomers whose minds had to be changed. We're the ones who had to have our minds changed about all this stuff. We're the ones who had to watch Billie Jean King play,
Bobby Riggs.
Thank you. And we're the ones who had to watch Maude, and we had to watch All in the Family, and we are the ones who had to change our minds about all this stuff.
We gladly did these things, by the way. I don't want those.
By the way, no, we were not pulled into this kicking and screaming. But the reason I say we're the ones who had to change our minds is because one of the most prominent thing that the Globetrotters did was that they were, just because of the way they would handle, if you watched a Globetrotters routine, what you would see is you'd see a black man with consummate skill doing something with a basketball. The white player from the Generals would make an attempt to get the basketball, and then just through some sheer act of legerdemain or magic or just, prestidigitation, poof, the ball's not there anymore, it's over here. And basically what that consisted of, if you watched a Globetrotters show, was half an hour, 45 minutes of black people teasing white people, just teasing them with their expertise, just playing with them a little bit. Now that kind of thing could have been extremely annoying and could have made racial matters much, much worse if it wasn't done with the style and the humor that Curly had and Meadowlark Lemon and all the rest of them had. There was an essential friendliness and playfulness that radiated out of them that was not an Uncle Tom kind of thing, because the Globetrotters were just the absolute masters of. They just completely mastered these fictional opponents, the Washington Generals. But they did it. They did it in a playful way, in a happy way, in a kind of a sportsmanlike and a fun way.
There was like a benign joy about it. There was
benign joy.
I can do this amazing thing in front of you and make you look a little silly, but I don't dislike you. Clearly the Washington Generals were in on the joke. I mean, they toured with the Harlem Globetrotters. It made me think, Bill, while you were talking, that I'm not a basketball fan, so I don't want to pretend to be one, but it may be watching the Harlem Globetrotters was really the last time that I saw somebody playing basketball. Well put.
And yeah, no, that's exactly right. You got it exactly right. And it was the playfulness, and that's why they are who they are, and they'll always be legendary. They'll always be immortal. And Sweet Georgia Brown goes with that too. The whole for those of you unfamiliar with the Harlem Globetrotters Act, there's a tune called Sweet Georgia Brown, and people would be whistling. It'd be a whistling soundtrack of somebody whistling Sweet Georgia Brown, while these guys would just run circles around these guys. It's difficult for people who grow up in kind of the dominant culture to understand the primal power that it has for minorities to see a member of a minority class constantly just beating a member of the majority class. It's like the 1936 Olympics 6,000 times over, however many games he played. It's like it was that. And another person who, along with Bill Cosby, whose reputation is sadly tarnished, nevertheless, you can't take away from him what he accomplished. And Sidney Poitier, who was just the gentleman of gentlemen, the champion of them all, obviously, is Jackie Robinson. But Nichelle Nichols, for example, I remember Whoopi Goldberg said repeatedly that she would, when Star Trek was on, she would scream for her parents to come and watch, because here was a black person on television who wasn't a maid, wasn't a cleaning person or a household maid or something. Here was a person who was competent, who was important, who was given command duties when they came about, who was always on the job, wasn't, they just said it was just so inspirational to see that on camera. And Star Trek was mid-'60s, so they're more or less around the same time. But this was the part of the civil rights movement that doesn't get enough attention. The political aspect of it gets a great deal of deserved attention, but the cultural part of this tremendous revolution in the mid-'60s doesn't get enough attention. And I think it's a measure of the importance of this kind of thing, that Nichelle Nichols wanted to quit Star Trek after the first season, and she met with Martin Luther King, who basically told her, you simply can't, you cannot leave this show. it's too important. You have to stay on this show.
And I think, Bill, what you're pointing out there is a good lesson for the rest of us. And for now, there are a lot of us, myself included, who are engaged in political speech in ways that are going to be endearing to people who already agree with me and off-putting to people who disagree with me. But you look at people like Curly Neal and Meadowlark Lemon and Bill Cosby in his day, and Flip Wilson and Sammy Davis Jr. These people, as a young kid growing up in a community that was almost exclusively white, at any given time there would be like one black student in our whole high school. I didn't think in terms of race when I was watching them. I just thought these people are cool. These people are entertaining. These people are fun. They're funny. They're nice. And by these people, I don't mean black people. I mean the people I was watching on TV. The
individuals.
Yeah. And so it completely bypassed that whole thing. Now, if somebody had stood up and said, hey, we're the Black Power basketball team and we mean to make things right for our race in this country, I think that they would have achieved a whole different kind of goal, but nowhere near the impact that they had.
That's right. And of all, I remember the first article I ever read that made me think, well, maybe I'm a conservative. And it was by George Will in Newsweek, and it was back when the movie Glory came out. Denzel Washington's story of the 54th Massachusetts, an all-black regiment that performed with outstanding gallantry against Battery Wagner in the Civil War. And Will was talking about how political leaders, black political leaders, would be the mid-'80s. There was some sort of thing going on with Reagan, and basically one of the leaders of the black community had gone to Reagan and said, or gone to somebody and said, look, you got to give us a victory on this one. And what Will said was, if you give somebody a victory, it's not a victory. He said, the only antidote for prejudice is excellence. That went through me like a spear. It just went through me like a diamond bullet between the eyes. The only antidote for prejudice is excellence. That's what the entire story of Glory was about. The 54th Massachusetts was black soldiers despised by the Confederacy and despised by a pretty reasonable number of the Union troops as well. But when the actual combat was over, these Union soldiers had watched how these black soldiers had died and how they fought and the gallantry they displayed, and a great deal of that racism disappeared in the face of excellence. The even more compelling case is the Tuskegee Airmen, a squadron of black fighter pilots in World War II who alone, among all of the escorting squadrons in World War II, never lost a bomber in their care. So the way that you cure racism is by having a racist in a bomber pilot, B-24 bomber pilot, thinking very little of black people, to say the least, and then looking out his window and seeing a guy in a P-51 with a red tail on it, and realize that this guy's just shot off 4 German fighters off of the bomber's tail, and that this guy is going to get to go home to his kids because of that black pilot over there who did an extraordinary job. That's how you cure racism. And this is why, when you get right down to the brass tacks of the whole thing, guys like Curly and Meadowlark, Bill Cosby, Portier, Nichelle Nichols, and all the rest, Jackie Robinson, all followed the example, or at least the course, set by Booker T. Washington. In his great debates with W.E.B. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois basically said, give us this, give us that. We, the black elite, the talented 10th, will then distribute this to the black community. But from the beginning, Booker T. Washington said, no, respect is something that has to be earned, and to the degree that we come into white society and merge with white society, we need to do it as equals, as people with our own businesses, people with our own enterprises, and people with excellence. And Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute had not only higher grade point average than white colleges around the country, but they also had a considerably higher legitimacy rate in terms of family structure. And it's just a great example of the power of example. And I know very few people under a certain age even know who we're talking about with Curly. But the reason you don't know about him is because of the success that he had and the courage that they had and what they had to undergo. And not to make a joke for the third time, but I'm going to do it anyway, I do think it would be worthwhile somewhere down the road to find I don't know, one of the lead players for the Washington Generals who went out there 6,000 times and lost every game because those guys were in on it too. It didn't require the same courage that the Globetrotters showed, but at the same time, you have to understand that the success of the Globetrotters was also a collaborative effort on the part of the white basketball players on the Generals who went out there for 30 years, generations of them, and basically went out there. These are competent basketball players, and they went out there in order to be made fun of every single night because they thought that it was important, and I think that it was important too.
Well, one final note on Curly Neal. He got his nickname actually when he joined the Globetrotters, and somebody on the team, either an agent or a coach, said, "We're going to call you Curly." But Fred Neal had been shaving his head since the age of 12. Did so without his mother's permission. And when he came home and his mother said, "What happened to you?" he said, "I fell asleep in the barber chair." But he really... It's something he wanted to do, and he maintained that throughout his life. America will miss Curly Neal, and I know that many people probably paused this episode and went immediately to YouTube to watch clips of the Harlem Globetrotters and specifically of Curly Neal. And please do that. Just watching him sliding around on the floor, dribbling circles around a member of the Washington Generals, and then ultimately bounce passing between his legs, picking up that ball and taking it in for an easy layup is a treasure. Not to mention the half-court shots that he seemed to be able to hit in the high 90% of the time. Ladies and gentlemen, the Harlem Globetrotters, as Bill has pointed out, have made a difference in this country, and we are glad to share their story, and we are sad to lose Curly Neal, a great American. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.
The action, the Trotters in possession, and Curly Neal trying his favorite shot from way out and hits. Trotters having one of the hottest afternoons I've ever seen them have. Look at Curly register his delight.
All right, look at it, Blacko.
Curly Neal again. I don't believe it. Preening and prancing Curly Neal, and the kids are delighted.